good morning, everybody. So what we're going to do today is that me and Nal, we're going to discuss about the role of culture and people in order to have a smooth and successful digital transformation. Now, we're going to start with a brief introduction about myself and Nav, and then I'm going through the agenda. So just to let you know who I am, as I already mentioned before, I'm a faculty lecturer at the School of Business of BPP. My area of expertise are digital transformation, digital leadership, change management, and project management. I'm an engineer by background, but I have a PhD in economics and international business, and I have an MBA from the IMD Business School in Switzerland. And just before joining BPP, I worked for many years, almost 10 years in multinational companies in different roles. But just the most relevant is that I was responsible for the change management process of the onboarding process of sales director for the Hilti Group in Northern Europe. Then I was responsible for changing the offer in the Southeast Asia, the same for Hilti Group. And then just before joining BPP, I was global project manager for the digital transformation of marketing and sales at the group level. And this is why basically I'm now teaching digital transformation at the BPP group. And now I'm going to hand over to Nav for its presentation.
Great. Thanks, Matilde. Navdeep Chouhan, Head of Programs at the Business School. I work very closely with Matilde on her program and her modules as well. My areas of expertise are around change management, emotional intelligence, leadership and leadership development as such. Worked in financial services for a number of years. Currently a serving part-time Chief Inspector for West Midlands Police, where we've been leading a number of digital transformation projects within the public sector organisations. So a completely different kettle of fish for us. Much more used to more sort of doing business as usual, not looking at how technology can aid us to do things better. So some really good examples we can bring into the conversation today from there, and really looking forward to having this discussion with you.
Good. So just a little bit on overview. So what we're going to discuss today is that, first of all, we're going to discuss about the importance for business to be digitally agile and the role that leaders played in this, in becoming basically digital agile. And then we're going to discuss about the importance of creating a digital ready culture. And we're going to discuss about what is the changes that the creation of a digital ready culture bring and how companies and people can manage those changes. And finally, we're going to discuss about what are the emotions that these changes bring with them and how basically companies can deal with those emotions, because companies are really made of people. So understanding what are the emotions and how you can deal with it, it's a very important piece of a successful digital transformation. But now, before starting, I'm going to ask you a couple of polls just to understand who you are and a little bit what is your experience with digital transformation so far. So I'm going to launch the first poll. If you can please fill it. So this one is the first question, is just a question about which sectors you are operating. Okay, yeah, so I can see that most of you are from finance, then we have somebody from pharma, healthcare, and then there are others which are not specified. So we've quite a mixed group of sectors, which I think is going to be interesting because, as you will see during the presentation, we are going to present case studies from different companies and different sectors. So I hope in this way it is going to be relevant for you. But then if you have questions which are more specific to your sectors, please feel free to ask. So we're going to give you more specific replies depending on your needs as well. And then I have another poll for you before we start. Right. I want to know a little bit based on your experience, what do you think are the biggest barriers to digital transformation? So basically, all of these are basically barriers that you have identified, but I can see that the main barrier at the moment is the silos culture. And we were going to cover this element during the conversation. But as you can see, like, there are a lot of barriers that basically are part of the digital transformation. Introduction of new technologies is actually the smallest one. And this is really relevant for the topic that we're going to cover today, because technology is actually the easiest part of a digital transformation. It's really creating breaking silos and creating collaboration. It's having also the right way of working and also dealing with the emotions that comes when a change is introduced, that are the main points for having a successful transformation. So I'm very, very happy that you basically selected all those points, because this is what we're going to cover now. So thank you very much for participating to those polls. Now, the first thing is that, so when it comes to digital transformation, what we need to keep in mind is that nowadays companies are working in what we call the VUCA environment, which is an extremely volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment. And this is becoming even more relevant during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, in order to be successful in this environment, what companies they need to do is that they need to become digitally agile. Now, becoming digital agile means to become hyper-aware, means to make good informed decisions, and means to executing fast. Now, hyper-awareness means that companies, they need to be able to understand what are the changes that are happening within the organization and outside of organization. In other words, companies, they need to understand what customer wants, what employees want, what are the macroeconomic trends, and at the same time, what is happening within the organization at operational level. Now, once they have a good understanding of what is happening, they need to make a decision, and they need to make a good one, right? Because again, we have no time. It's a very quick changing environment. And the best way to make a good decision is by leveraging on data and by leveraging on people. And this is why breaking silos is extremely important. It's really important to identify what are the right people to be involved, depending on the type of decision that you want to make. And this is why we need to think across hierarchy, and we need to think across department and across silos, and really try to create a pool of people that are good, a pool of decision makers that is really the right fit, depending on the decision that you want to take. But now, once the decision is made, you cannot lose time. You cannot waste time. You need to execute fast. And fast execution means that you basically have to be able to implement new processes quickly, or you need to be able to adapt existing processes quickly. And the best way to do it is to have a dynamic pool of technology that can be adapted depending on the needs, and to have a dynamic pool of talents that basically can be adapted also depending on the changing requirements, business requirements. Now, companies are already doing it. And if you can see on this slide, I just selected 3 companies that are already pretty successful in this domain. Now, for example, Nestle is extremely successful in being hyper-aware. And what this company has done in the last 5 to 7 years is that basically has developed more than 12 centers worldwide that do a very sophisticated social media listening. So Nestle is constantly monitoring what is happening on the most famous social media platform to really understand what are the trends and to really understand how the brand is perceived. And this is allowing really Nestle to adjust quickly to a very changing and very quick evolving environment. Now, another good example is also DHL. Now, DHL recently has introduced what is called smart warehouses. And what they did is that they really leveraged on Internet of Things technology to understand in real time what is happening in their massive warehouses and to make quick decisions in order to optimize like how the goods move, in order to guarantee a very good health and safety, in order to guarantee that they correctly manage the stock level and they don't waste money. So they are heavily leveraging on Internet of Things to make very, very good and quick decisions. And finally, another good example is in Citro. Now, in Citro, it's a very relevant case, I think, for nowadays, because what they are doing actually is that they combine research on laboratory with artificial intelligence in order to speed up the development of new drugs, which generally it's a very long and very expensive process. And this is really the future of the pharmaceutical sector, especially when it comes to the development of new drugs. And the pandemic has just accelerated basically this process that was already happening in the pharmaceutical sector. So these are just examples of how companies are already facing this transformation. But in order to become digitally agile, it's not only important to be hyper-aware, making good decisions and executing fast. It's also important to have the right set of leaders. And the IMD Business School a few years ago interviewed more than 5,000 leaders across the world. And they basically identified that the successful leaders in this context are what is called agile leaders. Now, agile leaders are leaders which are engaged, humble, adaptable, and visionary. Now, agile leaders, they have to be engaged because they have constantly be involved in this changing environment. They have constantly be interested in understanding what is happening within the organization and outside of the organization. But then they need to be humble because depending on those changes which are captured, they need to understand what are the right people that they need to talk to in order to make the right choice. Okay. Now the environment, the business environment is becoming more and more uncertain and complex. So it's very important to leverage on everybody, on other people's opinion and other people's experience in order to really react quickly and successfully. But at the same time, because we are working in a very unknown path, most likely we don't know what are going to be the solution. And this is why successful agile leaders are leaders which are also adaptable. It's very important to introduce a trial and error approach and learning of the way. Now, the risk of all this approach is that it's very easy to be lost and trapped in this constant loop of changes. And this is why having a vision of where you as a leader and you as a company wants to go, it's essential to keep track of what you're doing and to be successful in this digital transformation. Now, in this VUCA environment, what we discuss is very important for business to be digital agile and to have agile leaders. Another important piece is that this, for companies, important to develop what is called a digital ready culture. Now, if you look at Google, what Google defines as digital ready culture is a culture which has 4 characteristics. Is a customer-centric culture, which is also one of the elements that you identified as a key element. So it's very important for companies to put customer at the center of the activities. It's very important to incentivize collaboration and breaking silos across the different departments and also across the different people. And it's very important also to incentivize innovation. So people, they don't have to be afraid of trying new things, failing, learning from that, and keep trying. And finally, is also a culture which is a digital champion. So it's keeping introducing new technology because, again, the landscape is changing very quickly. So a technology that was introduced maybe 5 years ago, it's now obsolete. Now, if any of you has never dealt with the IT department, you will realize that being a digital champion, it's actually one of the biggest problem there because the IT department is actually one of the departments that is struggling the most to keep introducing new digital technologies. But really having these 4 elements in mind, it's so important in order to create a digital ready culture. Now, having a digital ready culture, it's important because this is what allows you to be hyper aware, make a good decision, and executing fast. But it's also important in order to become attractive for the best talents, because the talented people, they want to work for companies which are innovative. And innovative companies nowadays are the companies with these 4 characteristics. And now the last point that I want to cover is how actually you can become a digital ready culture, you as a business. Now, the first thing that you can do is to define what is your benchmark. Okay, what does it mean for you to be digital ready? And what are the behaviors that have to be changed internally in order to get there? Now, once the changes have been identified, it's very important to communicate those changes to your people and to leverage on leaders as a role models. And last but not least, you need to be sure that the people are part of this change. Your employees, they need to feel engaged, they need to feel empowered, and they need to feel they are really part of this. And this is why, before handing over to Nav, I wanted just to share the case of DBS, which is a very successful case of how a bank has created a digital ready culture. Now, 2 to 3 years ago, DBS sent its senior leaders to visit different digital champions and identify why they were successful, how were their cultures. Now, they used this digital champions culture as benchmark, and they identify which changes have to be implemented inside. And they realized that the main challenge of DBS was that they didn't have a customer-centric approach, and that employees didn't feel engaged. So they decided to focus on these two elements. Now, when they come to customer centricity, what they did is that they really started to heavily use data to constantly monitor customer needs. And they completely changed priorities within the organization, deciding only to prioritize projects and activities which were important for customers. For example, one thing that they did is that they focused on a project for reducing the waiting time for customers. And then they decided to select digital technologies that they really can help to speed up those projects. And this is why they introduced the chat box. And finally, they changed the way of working internally, and they completely switched the IT department and product development department to agile methodology to be sure that really the companies could keep up with this constant change of customer needs. On the employee side, what they did is that, again, they leverage on data in order to understand employees' behaviors. For example, they really try to understand why employees were leaving or predicting if an employee was leaving and understanding why. And then they were also giving much more freedom of experimentation to the employees. And finally, they were really giving opportunities for development to employees by basically introducing coaching and mentoring initiatives, introducing also different collaboration platforms. And thanks to this, basically now DBS is one of the most successful company and one of the most attractive company, especially in the Southeast Asian environment. And I think this is a very good example to see how companies can really become successful by leveraging on people. Okay. And now I'm going to hand over to Nav for the rest of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Matilde. We're now going to move the conversation really to the next part. We're going to start to look at the change process itself. Now, if you type into a search engine, change management or change leadership, change processes or structures, you're going to get hundreds of millions of replies back or responses back. Some of the key models and theories actually are very basic in nature, and it can be applied to lots of different examples. And there's three here that I've picked out that I wanted to discuss today. But really the two most important ones for me are the ones by Lewin, which is the Lewin's change model theory, and Kotter's 8-step process. So if we take Lewin to begin with first, Lewin believes there are 3 steps to all change programs. It doesn't matter what that change program is. It could be changing something within a department, within an organization. It could be changing a function of the business. It could be amalgamating or bringing together 2 separate companies into one. The 3-step process has to take place. The first one is unfreeze. This is essentially where we undo what we do at the moment. So we break down what we currently do. That could be the culture, that could be processes, that could be the way we work at the moment. The next stage is the transition period. How do we move from how we are today to what we ideally want to become post-change? So that is the transition period. And then once that transition period has taken place, we then need to refreeze that new way of working so that becomes the norm of the business. Very basic model, but can be applied in lots of examples. So I'll give you one example that I've been managing with the police service. We've moved our online, from if you have an emergency and you want to call 999, we actually now have an online platform that allows you to go onto our website and you can report a crime using our online platforms. That's a different way of working, massively different to how it's been done for the last 60, 70 years. And that was a real culture change for a lot of internal colleagues within the business. So it's about having conversations with people, taking them through the change process and getting them to buy into the reasons why we were changing. It was much more effective and much more efficient, but it's really important you don't forget the people who are going to be taking part in that change program. The second one is Kotter's 8-step process. Now, I quite like Kotter's model because it takes you from really start to end of a change program. We need to create a sense of urgency. Pepsi's chief executive 10 years ago at the time looked at how the fast food and drinks market was going to change in the next 10 to 15 years. Her role as a change leader was to horizon scan. What was going to be the upcoming things that were going to impact our business and the way we did business? She saw the change in Coca-Cola and the way Coca-Cola managed its business and connected with its market. Pepsi took a very different approach to their business. They went more B2B. So when you go to a cinema chain or a fast food chain, you won't see, very rarely will you see a Coca-Cola machine behind the counter. You'll see more likely a Pepsi machine. So Pepsi started to see the threat within the marketplace, how that was going to change, and they saw the sense of urgency to do something differently. The next step is to build your team. So strategically, you've got a need to change. You must change. You're the change leader. You're seeing something coming from the horizon. It is now looking at within your business, who are going to be those key people who are going to drive the change forward. Strategically, you can identify the change, but you need to have those managers on the ground who are going to buy into the change and help transform the business. The next stage after that is form that strategic vision, ensuring you stay true to that strategic vision. External factors could change your strategic vision, so making sure it remains up to date and fresh is key. The pandemic has been a massive example of changes to strategic visions for lots of businesses. Enlist your change agents. Change agents are fundamentally important for all change programs. So change agents are the ones who are your positive army, who go into the business, into all the departments and functions, and promote the values of the change, the positivities of the change. They become your voice of reasoning in justifying why the change needs to take place. Please be aware of your barriers. It was really interesting. A lot of you have identified resistance to change as being one of the factors as to why change doesn't happen. I'm going to talk about resistance in a moment. It's a really important part to understanding who those resistances are and how you're going to overcome them. Celebrate your short wins. We rarely share with our colleagues some of the short wins that we've achieved. So sharing short wins with your teams, with the organization, actually reinforces the reason why we need to do this change program. So don't just focus on the long term. You may have a small win you want to share with colleagues. Most change programs are not for this short term. It is a long-term journey. Most organizations, if not all who I've been speaking to, are going through some form of change. We're going to hear from Dal in just a moment on their examples. It is a long-term journey. How do you sustain that growth? Company colleagues, senior colleagues may move from the business. They may take that knowledge with them. How do you replenish that? What sort of considerations do you need to make? And as you go through this 8-step process, you become an institutional change program. So actually the organization now has entered that refree stage of Lewin's model. It's the new way of doing business. It's institution wide, and that's how we now conduct our business at the organization. The ADCAR model, I won't go into too much detail, but it really picks out the key areas that I've just mentioned with those two. Personally, I really like this model when it comes to your emotions. Now, as we're going through change, we're working with a lot of colleagues. Our employees are one of our key assets within the business. And when we're going through change, and we first announce change, very often our colleagues will go through an emotional journey. The emotional journey is very similar to the one that is on the screen today. I'm going to start from the very beginning where you're told something's going to change. That could be the way you work. That could be a location. That could be you've been made redundant because your role no longer exists. That could be a personal thing to you. You've failed a driving test, or you've got some bad news about your medical health. This model really pinpoints the key emotional journey. Why is this important? Change leaders and change managers need to know when they're talking to their colleagues, this is the journey your colleagues are going to be going through. We start from the very beginning. Anxiety. Something's going to change. The first thing your fellow colleagues, your followers will feel is anxiety. How is this going to impact me? What is going to be different from what I'm doing today to what I'm going to do tomorrow? anxiety. Then they start to build a camaraderie within their subgroups. So their teams, their subgroups within their teams, and they start to sort of comfort each other, try to second guess what the change program is going to be all about. And then as you go through the emotional journey, if, for example, we're letting a colleague go because their role is no longer a part of the organization moving forward, they start to gain sort of this fear and anger and threat and guilt. Was it me who was performing poorly in my role? Was it because it was me they've got rid of me? And they start to have this emotional turmoil taking place. The key part where a change manager or a leader can really make a difference is at this point where we have depression. Now, depression is key. That is the lowest point a human being will go through. So no matter what circumstance you're in, it is at that point you'll either carry on going through depression, hostility, and then continue on to potential mental health illness, or you actually have some gradual acceptance and you start to accept your situation and then you start to move on. Now, as a change manager, I will give you an example of a colleague in a different organization who I'd been working with, and they had been made redundant. Now, they'd been in the business for over 14 years, so very committed organization to the organization, added a lot of value. But as technology moved on, their role no longer really had a fit within the business moving forward. There's two ways we could have handled that. We could have told that colleague at the very beginning, you no longer have a role within the business. Here is your brown envelope. Thank you very much for your 14 years and off you go. That individual would have gone through this emotional turmoil and more than likely would have gone down the depression and hostility route and actually then led on to potential mental health issues later on. But as experienced change leaders and managers, as you're going through that journey, what I did say to that individual was, why didn't you take 2 or 3 days to take the news, calm down, talk to family and friends, let's meet up afterwards and let's catch up and see how you're doing. And what I did is I caught that person at that depression stage 3 or 4 days later. And I knew from their personal circumstance, there was somebody who was very interested in baking cakes. They always wanted to set up their own business in baking cakes, but because they've been in the business for 14 years, this false sense of needing to work full time and needed that security, that comfort blanket. She was given a payout from the organization. Actually, the conversation 3 or 4 days later was, don't see this as a negative, see this as an opportunity. You've always talked about you've wanted to do that hobby, take it forward to make it a career. And actually, I've seen her now accept her circumstance and actually saw it as an opportunity rather than a threat. So when we're talking to colleagues about change, don't just give them the knowledge at the very beginning and leave them alone. Keep communicating. Communication is key. We've talked about resistance. We've talked about lack of commitment. Communication is the key. If you talk to your colleagues and keep them updated on how that change program is taking place and some of the challenges and barriers and being honest with them, then you will gain the commitment through. I just want to touch on emotional intelligence. Clive, I know we've run over ever so slightly, so I will summarize these for you. But emotional intelligence is key. So as a change leader and change manager, knowing your own emotions is fundamentally important. So this Goldman is one of the key leaders around emotional intelligence. He looks at 4 key areas. Self-awareness, you know your own personal strengths and weaknesses. You know yourself, how you emotionally react to certain situations. Social awareness, you look at recognizing others around you and how they will react to certain situations and how they will deal with certain situations within the organizations. Relationship management focuses very much about building a rapport with your colleagues, getting to know who they are. Now, I know there's a scalability issue here. If you've got a team of 200, that's not going to be easier to do, and it's more challenging to do on a virtual environment than face-to-face, but trying to build some form of rapport to allow you to take a more coaching, mentoring style would add value. And most importantly is being able to manage emotions effectively. I'll give you one personal example to me. My good lady, my good wife, who gets very emotional when she watches very sad films, would go for a movie and I'll take a packet of tissues with me because I knew what was going to happen next. That's emotional intelligence. Looking ahead of a situation, how is that person going to react to that situation and being able to prepare for it yourself. The final thing, Clive, before I hand back over to you, is as we're going through change, we talked about resistance. Resistance is a really key part to any change programs. They exist and they tend to operate in quite covert areas. One of the big four supermarkets did a fantastic study on resistance to change programs. And they did, within their head office, they looked at where does resistance take place. Now, you would think it would take place in very obvious places like cafeterias or in offices or near desks. It used to take place near coffee machines or water coolers. Now, what this organization did is they removed those areas where there was coffee being made and water machines, and they just placed them in different areas in the office. But by removing central points which brought people together to share resistance and share concerns, actually allowed those individuals to open up a bit more to colleagues within their own teams. So understanding as a change leader or manager who your resistors are and how to work with them will better enable you to have a successful change program. My final comment before I hand over is about the people in the middle. You're going to have 20% who are pro change, 20% who are going to be fully against the change. There's about 60% in the middle. This 60% are not sure whether they are for or against. As a change leader or manager, you must identify who are those 60%. Start to work with them, start to communicate with them, start to gain their buy-in to the change program. Because as you're doing that, the resistors are also working with them to try and turn them against the change program. So I have covered a lot already, and I will hand back to Clive now.